Thursday is the day when it all goes down. Yesterday, we saw one of Jesus' closest friends and disciples, Judas Iscariot, agree to betray him for the small price of 30 silver coins. Today, we're going to see that betrayal come to fruition. We don't know what Jesus was up to for the majority of the day. It's possible that he was teaching in the temple, or possible that he was taking the day off. But we know that at some point, he sent 2 of his disciples to go and acquire a room for them to eat dinner. The disciples acquire an upper room where Jesus and his 12 gather together to eat their final meal together. At the beginning of the meal, a dispute breaks out amongst the disciples, and they're debating who is the greatest. Jesus, in response to this, in order to teach them a lesson, gets up and washes their feet. As their dinner progresses, Jesus begins to speak more ominously, and he tells them that one of them will betray him. One by one, they go around saying, "Is it I, Lord? Is it I, Lord?" None of them speaks up and begins accusing the others of betraying Jesus. Rather, they accuse themselves, which tells us that Judas wasn't the typical villain that we picture him as being. Instead, they trusted Judas and they trusted one another. They doubted themselves before they would doubt even Judas. Eventually, however, Judas does leave the table and nobody quite knows why. They think that he's actually gone out to do something holy, like giving money to the poor, as was custom for Passover. During all this time, Jesus continues to speak ominously and he continues to speak of his coming betrayal. At one point, he takes bread and he takes wine, and he institutes a new covenant, one which picks up the customs and the imagery from the Passover which they were already celebrating, which was all about God's deliverance of his people from bondage. Jesus says that according to this new covenant, the bread represents his body, which is broken for his people, and the wine represents his blood, which is poured out on their behalf. Once again, Jesus continues to speak ominously, as if this is his final night with them, and that's exactly what he tells them. He says that he will not partake in this meal again until the end of days, and he says that he has been desperately waiting for this moment to arrive. As the supper progresses, Jesus begins to teach his disciples. He voices words of comfort, perceiving that they are troubled in spirit because of the things that he has said to them. He tells them that he will return to them and that he's going away for a little bit, but they need not be worried. After singing a few hymns, Jesus announces that the time has come to leave. And so they arise, they exit the city of Jerusalem, they walk through the Kidron Valley, and they make their way to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus would often frequent to pray. Along the way, Jesus continues to teach. He talks about vines and branches. He prays for them. He prays for us. And then whenever he gets to the garden, he withdraws and he prays to God for himself. And this is the prayer that Jesus says. He says, "Father, if it be possible, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Jesus is absolutely terrified of what's to come, and in many ways his human side wants to avoid it, but at the same time he is willing to commit to God and willing to go through with what he must do in order to save mankind. But while Jesus is doing all this, his disciples have fallen asleep. In the time when he needed them most, they've dozed off. 3 times he goes to check on them, but each time they've fallen asleep. And he rebukes them, Simon Peter in particular, who he has already announced will betray him by denying him 3 times that very night. And he tells Simon Peter to watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. For the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And indeed, Simon Peter demonstrates this to be true by continuing to fall asleep along with the rest of the disciples. At long last, Jesus returns to them and wakes them up for a final time, announcing that the betrayer is at hand. It's at this moment that the flames of torchlight begin to dot the distance, and a squadron of soldiers with Judas Iscariot at their lead walks into the garden. Judas walks up to Jesus and identifies him with a kiss. Jesus turns to him and rebukes him, but greets him as a friend. Jesus turns to the soldiers and says, "Who are you seeking for?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am he." And as he pronounces those words, they fall backwards. Once they arise, Simon Peter, ashamed and embarrassed of his constant failure over the course of the night, decides in one final blow to try to defend Jesus. He raises up his sword and he goes in for the attack, and in doing so, he cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant named Malchus. Jesus rebukes Peter and says that those who will live by the sword will die by the sword, and he goes forward and he reaches down and he picks up Malchus's ear and he heals it. It's at this moment that Jesus turns to the soldiers and he says that he will willingly hand himself in so long as they promise not to harm the disciples. But it wouldn't matter either way because the disciples fled for their lives. And so Jesus, abandoned by his friends whenever he needed them most, willingly hands himself into custody and is taken off to trial. Jesus of Nazareth will be dead within 24 hours.